And so I'm Eric. I'm Director of Development at Waterfront Toronto, and that's Director of Real Estate Development. There are a lot of different developments, but I got a call the other day from an IT guy. That's not me. And so I want to take you through the Volume 3 materials. And I also wanted to say thanks so much for coming early in the morning. We think it's an important discussion. That's why we're here. So we're glad to see that other people think so too. So the structure of the presentation is based on providing you with information that is from the MIDP. It's actually based on the structure that's in the note to reader. So most of the information in the presentation will be directly from the MIDP. I will call out specifically when I depart from the MIDP. There are a couple of areas that Christina mentioned in the plenary discussion about priority considerations, and I'll point those out. And just to be clear, the material that we are covering is most of Volume 3. It is not all of Volume 3. There's a lot in there, and so we're going to cover the key issues. And so the key issues are the idea district, the roles for Sidewalk Labs, transaction economics, and government obligations. And if you look at Volume 3, the idea district and roles for Sidewalk Labs and transaction economics are actually all chapters in the MIDP. Roles for Sidewalk Labs is called the Innovation and Funding Partner Proposal. And then we have government obligations, which is not a specific chapter from the MIDP, but we've cobbled it together to make it quite clear. I think one of the important things we need to point out is that this is Sidewalk Labs' proposal, and we're really hoping to explain it to you and get your feedback. That's the point of this presentation. That's a repeat. So first thing we're going to talk about is the idea district. So the idea district covers 190 acres of land, which is more than the 12 acres, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it has a proposed governance model and a phased approach that would be at the discretion and approval of governments. And so there are three big pieces in it, and I'll walk through them. There's the public administrator, an innovation framework, and financial mechanisms. So the public administrator is there in order to oversee all of the idea district and act in a way similar to what Waterfront Toronto has done in the past. And it's supported by a Waterfront Toronto Transportation Management Association and the Waterfront Sustainability Association and a Waterfront Housing Trust. Those are three of the five management entities that Sidewalk Labs has proposed. The other two are the Open Space Alliance and the Urban Data Trust. And the reason that those are not on this list is because they do not report back up to the public administrator. But they are in Volume 3, and they are important and worth discussion. The next piece is the innovation framework. And so what Sidewalk is proposing is that there'll be some regulatory relief in some aspects that apply to the project. And there'll also be other obligations that would be imposed upon development in that area. And so that would be all laid out in an innovation framework, and it's further discussed in the proposal. And finally, we have financing mechanisms in order to deliver a lot of the key infrastructure that is required to build out the entire area. There's a number of financing mechanisms, such as changes to development charges, land value adjustments, reinvestments, and finally, tax increment financing is another one. And I just want to take 2 seconds to talk about tax increment financing because it'll be, I think, relevant as we move forward. And so if you imagine an area that doesn't have any infrastructure and you need to put infrastructure there, you need to figure out a way to pay for it. And one way of paying for it would be to say, well, when the future development comes, the revenues that are generated from a property tax point of view will be much higher. So today I'm going to borrow money, and I'm going to pay it back with those future revenues. And I think that concept we'll touch on again later. And so that's the material that's in the MIDP. And just 1 second. And so now there are three of these blue boxes in my presentation that outline the priority concerns. I'm going to continue to go through the presentation, and then maybe we'll ask questions at the end. Is that?
For the purposes of the filming, I think they have to let him finish, and we're going to have an hour to discuss in detail at your tables, and every one of the 4 tables has somebody that knows as much about this as Eric. So you will have a really meaningful opportunity to get into it.
Yeah, I'm actually sitting at your table, so. So priority considerations. So this is not in the MIDP. This is a Waterfront Toronto's point of view, and want to point out clearly, and Christina pointed this out in the plenary, that the RFP contemplated a 12-acre development area as a test bed for future technologies and innovation. And the Waterfront Toronto believes that the 190 acres proposal is premature, and we want to see how these goals and objectives are implemented on Quayside before we would agree to advance any further into the idea district. And if there was an advancement into the idea district, that would be at the discretion and at the requirement of our government stakeholders. So that's the sort of the concepts behind the idea district, and I want to take you to the geography of the idea district, which Christina also talked about it at the top, but I think I can add a few more tweaks to it that would be valuable to go through it again. So the dashed line is the 190-acre area. And in that 190-acre area, 80% of the lands in that area are owned by the private sector. The public sector, not the private sector. And so that'll be an important issue that I think we want to talk about in a second. But first off, here's Quayside. That's the 12-acre parcel, which is mostly, let's change words, mostly owned by Waterfront Toronto, and then here's Villiers West. So in these dark blue areas, Sidewalk Labs is proposing to lead the real estate development, so lead the development and construction of buildings in those areas. And then the remainder of the area would then be subject to the innovation framework that I talked about on the slide before. So Sidewalk Labs would build here and show how those technologies and proposals that they are putting forward could work. And then should they work, the other areas would then be subject to those requirements, and other private sector developers would build meeting those obligations. And that is, to be clear, and I've said this a few times, Sidewalk Labs' proposal. Other important things to point out on this map are the LRT and the importance and the funding requirements that go behind that, and we'll talk about that a bit more. And just while we're looking at the map, you can see this green line. That's the River District. If you review the the Volume 1 materials, you see that the proposal is really broken up into Quayside and then the remainder, which is the River District. And I think that's it for that. So the next thing that we were going to talk about, we're going to talk about Idea District, and then we're going to talk about roles for Sidewalk Labs. And before we go into the roles for Sidewalk Labs, I want to revisit the slide that Christina put at the top in the plenary to talk about how they make money, because what they do and how they make money are integrated, and I'm going to break that down a bit more in the next slides, but let's just revisit this so we're all generally aware of what their business models are. So real estate, we talked a little bit about how they're proposing to do real estate development in the Quayside and on Villiers West. That's together, that's 32 acres of development. And so what this says is that not only would they do the actual real estate development in Quayside and Villiers West, but they would also investigate technologies such as tall timber and passive house. And should those technologies prove to be successful, they could sell tall timber out of a plant, but also they could sell the technology around it and expertise around it. So if they're successful, they would sell those technologies and expertise and potentially the products around the world. Technology, so Sidewalk has said that there are a number of technological innovations that they believe that they are well suited to advance. One of the ones that is in Volume 2 is called schedulers. So that's a technology product that takes the energy use in multiple buildings and tries to distribute it evenly in order to optimize. It's really an optimization software in order to share energy between buildings. And so should that prove to be successful, that would then go on to be sold to other cities around the world, other developments. And so that's just one example of a technology. And then lastly, infrastructure. As Christina mentioned, there is a number of different types of advanced infrastructure that Sidewalk Labs is proposing, such as advanced electrical grids. So that scheduler thing I was just talking about, that would be managed, or that would manage an advanced electrical grid that would share energy from the traditional energy grid, but also separate buildings. So you have a number of buildings. Each building has photovoltaics and batteries. And so all that is working in concert. So that's an advanced infrastructure system. And to the extent that they can provide funding for that or figure out solutions for that, that would be another line of business. And then if successful, they would sell around the world. And just to be clear, these are 3 discrete columns, but actually you could start mixing and matching. You could say technology to deliver prefabricated modular wood panels is actually, that's a software product, and it fits into here. So we could start saying the products are, although I think it's useful to think about them in 3 columns, they're not actually discrete. So now we're going to go through the 4 roles that Sidewalk has proposed. And again, that's the Innovation and Funding Partner Proposal section of the note to reader. And so starting at the top, we talked a little bit about this. This is real estate development in Quayside and Villiers West. And so they would lead that development. That's their proposal. And they would make income as any other real estate developer would. The proposal is clear that because of the innovation and implementation risk that would be sought or achieved by delivering these, by constructing these things, that the average return would be lower than a traditional real estate development. And they're saying they're willing to shoulder that upfront risk. And then innovation planning, design, and implementation. So that's really about advisory services. So to the extent that they spend money on R&D to figure out solutions on some of the things I've mentioned, they would also be willing to provide their advisory services. And the MIDP says they would provide for the Quayside project those advisory services at cost at roughly $3 million a year. And then technology deployment. I think we've covered that idea about different technologies that could be used. And then optional enabling infrastructure financing. So I mentioned about the TIF at the beginning. And so that concept about needing to build municipal infrastructure or advanced infrastructure and the financing that is needed, TIF is one way to do that. In order to set up a TIF, money is also required. And so one example is Sidewalk Labs has proposed $100 million to debt that they would offer that money as debt financing to set up the TIF, and then they would then make interest on that loan. And so, and it says in the MIDP at rates to be negotiated. So it's a bank. That's banking. And then we have 3 others that we're going to talk about, other income opportunities. So Sidewalk Labs has said that they would put forth $10 million to do a venture fund. So that's the first one, to provide seed funding to early startup companies that are providing innovative technology solutions and things in the urban development area. And so to the extent that one of those companies becomes successful and they had invested in it, they could make money off of that. Potential income from investments in tall timber factory. So they're proposing to spend or invest $80 million in a tall timber factory to provide these tall timber pieces, and there'd be pre-modular things like that. So all of that is another potential income source. And then finally, performance payments. And I think that this one's a bit unique, so let's go a little bit slowly on this one. Sidewalk Labs has said that they can achieve a number of the goals that Waterfront Toronto has set out and some other goals. And if they can do that in a certain time based on metrics that we would determine in advance, they think that they should be paid a performance payment to reward them for having achieved these goals. And I think that that's something that we all should talk about. That's their proposal, and I think it's something we should, if we have time or if people have interest, it's something we can drill down into in the tables. And so just before I move on, that's 7 things I've pointed out, but actually it's slightly condensed. You can see on your tables there is a list of 11 things. It's that one sheet here. This one piece of paper is the 11 income generating opportunities for Sidewalk Labs. And so I have covered them all in 7 items, but if you want more information, that's page 179 from the MIDP, and there are copies on their table. Okay, transaction economics. So some of this will start to be a little bit repetitive, but I think that that's okay, and we'll get some new insight on some of the things. Before we go on to what Sidewalk Labs proposed, I just want to be clear, I want to set up a question here that Waterfront Toronto is asking, and I think is at the heart of what we are discussing today. And so there's a question, there's a setup. Let me give you the setup, which is that our publicly owned waterfront lands have enormous value. Sidewalk Labs is proposing that Waterfront Toronto reduce the price of public lands in return for achieving the policy outcomes such as job creation, economic development, and sustainability, which Sidewalk Labs proposes to deliver. So that's a statement, and that's in the MIDP. That is somewhat similar to Waterfront Toronto's traditional operating model, which is to say we take lands to market and say, we're going to sell this piece of land, and the purchaser needs to meet certain obligations like advanced sustainability requirements. What will the market pay for that combination of things? And so this is a little bit different than that, but it's not a huge departure. So when you see that and you say, well, Sidewalk Labs is being pretty bold about reductions, it's not completely net new. But the important question here is, what are we willing to give / invest in order to receive the benefits Sidewalk Labs is proposing? So the crux of it is that we as the public sector, we as Waterfront Toronto, need to make a deal with Sidewalk Labs. It is not just that they are going to give us these things and we're just going to sit back. There's a deal to be had here, and so there's land value to be invested, there's policy reform to be thought about, there are, as Nicole has put a couple of times, and I assume that you put it today, I can't remember, what are we going to give in order to get? That's the trade-off that we need to think about. And so now that we've had that discussion, we can return back to the contents of the MIDP. And so the real estate piece here, Sidewalk is proposing that we sell the lands directly to them so that they can be the lead developer. I think that takes us to another one of our priority concerns, which is that the initial RFP said that we would select the innovation and funding partner, and then after we had worked out the plan, we would go and seek real estate developers. And so what you can see there is that our board chair has made it quite clear that should the MIDP go forward, it would be on the basis that Waterfront Toronto lead a competitive RFP for real estate developers. And so there's also in the MIDP, there are different scenarios for how to calculate land value. And I think we'll save that for the tables if people want to talk about that. And then infrastructure, we talked a bit about the optional financing and financing for advanced systems. So I'm not going to touch on that. And then intellectual property, I'll give you 2 sentences on that, and then actually a more robust conversation on that is happening in the intellectual property data use room. But basically what the MIDP says is that to the extent that technological solutions piloted at Quayside are test bed enabled, those are their words, test bed enabled, i.e. that we as the public sector create the conditions to test these things out, they would share profits with the public sector. So they would share 10% of the profits for the first 10 years after the product has been sold to a second customer. So in Quayside, it would be piloted, and then they sell it commercially, and then we share those profits. That's the proposal. And then this is my last slide. This is government obligations. And so you just need to be clear that Sidewalk's proposal relies on a number of government obligations. So we need to think about whether those things are things that we want our governments to do. And so there's investment in municipal infrastructure. The Portlands requires a huge amount of investment in municipal infrastructure into the multi-billions. And you can see those numbers broken out in the MIDP, including infrastructure. The LRT is infrastructure related to that. And then below market housing program, the MIDP lays out a affordable housing program. The first 20% of the most affordable units would be paid for or subsidized by the public sector and the traditional model. So that's a usual model, but it's putting in for Quayside and Villiers West $127 million to deliver that part of the affordable housing program comes from the public sector. And then the non-for-profit third-party management entities. So I talked about those 5 entities. Those, some of them have proposals for how they can be somewhat self-sustaining, but I don't think any of them are completely self-sustaining. So the public sector would also need to invest in keeping those entities operating. And lastly, the policy and regulatory reform. So there's what they call targeted/regulatory adjustments. So those are regulatory changes that would allow the proposal to move forward, and then the implementation of additional obligations that are set out in the Innovation and Design Standard Guidelines, what I call the innovation framework at the top of the presentation. So last thing to consider here, and Christina already mentioned this in her part of the presentation, is that Sidewalk Labs proposal relies on government investment and obligations such as funding the LRT, and Waterfront Toronto is not in a position to make those obligations, and so we need to make that absolutely clear. And that is it.
Excellent. So the plan now is we'll spend the next half hour, maybe 40 minutes at the smaller tables with asking questions or providing, sorry about that. The plan now is, notwithstanding the fact that you can hear me, I guess it's the fact that we're being taped. We're going to spend half an hour to 40 minutes at your smaller tables to give you a chance to ask questions and dig into the material. The facilitators will be taking notes, and we will make sure that we'll check in at 20 to 11, but definitely not later than quarter to 11. We'll make sure that we have time for a full room discussion, because that has been one of the richest moments from the last couple of meetings, where we get a sense of, okay, what Amr talked about and Jeff talked about here actually picked up on what was talked about here, but then there was a different angle. Here might have been similar or not, and then it really gave us a good handle on what was happening in the room as a whole. So we'll check in at 20 to 11, but no later than quarter to. So the cameras are going off for the small table discussion, but they'll come back on when we do the report back. Okay, great. And introduce yourself to get started. Maybe I'll start us off, and then I'll come over here and we'll just work around the room. There's no way I'm going to do justice, and I just to all of the detail that I've got notes on. So I just want to assure you that all of the notes that all of the facilitators have taken will be part of the documentation from today. You're going to see it in draft, and I'll want you to take a close look at what we document from the partnership room. You'll have about a week to look at it in draft. Make sure we got your point correctly, and if it's off from what you said in this room, then let us know and we'll fix it. It's not the opportunity to weigh in with a ton more. We just want to have an accurate reflection of what happened in this room. So very quickly, I'm going to go a little chronologically and then figure out how to tie it together after. But in broad strokes, we had the recognition that, I guess straight out of the gate, grateful that Waterfront Toronto, kind of an unheard of 20-year cooperation, institutionalized cooperation of the 3 levels of government, is something that would be so great to have in potentially on other policy issues. Isn't it important that that agency exists? The reason I'm starting with that is because the corollary was said to
companies like Google, and by implication Sidewalk Labs, where they are have the capacity to behave in a way that's more like a bully, that's not accountable to any nation state. So to be quite aware of who you're at the table with, and demonstrate that Waterfront Toronto is listening to what the public is saying, and acknowledge the complexity of the issues and push back where that pushback is necessary in order to earn trust. It's not as eloquent as was said here, but I'll start with that. We talked a little bit about the relationship between Waterfront Toronto and the city, and people very interested in how that relationship works. Particularly because there are a lot of things that are being proposed, for example, at the planning scale that Waterfront Toronto could be doing, and the comment was made that I need to be persuaded that the private corporation has a role in doing what Waterfront Toronto does, particularly thinking about the planning at the large scale. Really emphasizing that the regulatory framework for disruptive technology is not in place today, and that in fact there would be multiple competing, potentially colliding regulatory frameworks. And so that is a critical issue for Waterfront Toronto to consider. And that there is huge potential, but there's also huge risk. And so I guess there were a few comments made to identify examples of other places on the planet where something similar has happened, or a similar regulatory framework or new regulatory framework has emerged that we could integrate into, that Waterfront Toronto can integrate into this process, and to learn from those other examples. I'll just end where we wrapped up, which we also had Councillor Fletcher drop by our table, so it added a little flavor to the discussion. But I think there was the notion that you might think that the proposal is just a proposal, and the fact that it went past the 12 acres doesn't necessarily mean that Sidewalk has a right to do anything beyond the 12 acres. That being said, they put it in their proposal. We asked for innovation. It doesn't mean that Waterfront Toronto is obliged to do it, but we don't have to be so put off that it was there in the first place. So maybe there's a way that we start with 12 acres, and then as we see what works, maybe go bigger, and really hoping that Waterfront Toronto can maintain the spirit of the letter that the chair wrote, continue to consult, and not make a decision very quickly to stop along this exploratory path, because it has the potential to benefit as long as we put the right conditions in place. More or less. Okay. It was extremely smart, and hoping there's some connections to what everybody else was saying.
Hello, so I'm Amir. So there were some overlap with this table. Some folks on the table felt that they were excited about the idea district and what it proposes, and it may be an opportunity to strengthen our institutional systems right now in the city. However, then there's also some concerns and some ideas to move forward. So there was a big consensus that the decisions for this need to be within the City of Toronto. That someone said this sounds like a fourth level of government. And so there's an idea that we need a bit more trust in what is being proposed with those new entities, and that the city, that they would move forward with the idea district or the ideas proposed if it was located within the city's governance. The idea of profit sharing. So there was a concern and a question that what happens after the many years if what's being proposed in us receiving profits as a city gets moved to offshore. and now they're not paying taxes on this. So the suggestion was that we need to have really good a legal framework to ensure that whatever is being said in terms of sharing profits, it's not just 10 years, it's much longer term. And the last piece was really mapping out some longer term unintended outcomes. So this is what's being proposed now, but this is a prime piece of land. So what else could have happened there that we're not looking into? And we really need to map out these outcomes in increments rather than this one big thing that's being proposed. There was a lot more that was said. I hope I caught the summary of it.
Thanks, Amr. So we had a great discussion, lots of really good detailed questions. Like Amr mentioned, in our group, we had some very specific questions that were laid out that will be captured, but the general themes that emerged. First and foremost, there was a general theme of who is Sidewalk Labs. It's still a bit opaque, and more clarity is needed about who they are as a company and what their objectives are with this project. Also questions about who Sidewalk is partnering with, and that there needs to be more clarity around who they're partnering with this project. That was really underpinned by concerns about trust and whether or not we should trust them. So certainly, at the very least, more clarity is needed, but there were a lot of questions about whether or not we should trust them given that they are new to this type of project, they are a tech company, they're not an entity that Waterfront Toronto has traditionally dealt with. The second comment here was around the process itself, that it could be potentially flawed. So one of the comments was that it sounds like Waterfront Toronto may already be a partner here, and so it was a bit unclear from some of the comments that were made as to whether or not they are sort of bought in as a partner. There was discussion around the agreements that Waterfront Toronto currently has with Sidewalk Labs versus what they would have down the road, depending on whether or not they move forward with this. There was concerns about why this consultation process has proceeded without a proper risk assessment being done and asking the public for comment on something that may not be feasible or realistic when a risk assessment specifically hasn't been done. Similarly, there were comments about the timelines themselves and whether or not they may be realistic for the project that we're looking at. And then there was also a comment in a similar vein as to why there are why there were not different proposals considered with different concepts or levels of innovation. Why, when Sidewalk Labs came back with this particular project, has Waterfront Toronto proceeded to move forward with just this and not others? And that was really centered around a conversation about if this doesn't proceed, what happens? Do we start from scratch? Do we start over again? So that was some of the questions and the concerns surrounding that. But there were also comments on the public education component and how we can offer more clarity for that. So specifically, there were comments on the need to explain this proposal in a bit more detail, but in a succinct way. So perhaps doing a one-pager explaining the proposal itself from Sidewalk Labs, but also how this consultation may be different. So really looking at what has Waterfront Toronto traditionally done, and how is this proposal from Sidewalk Labs different than what they've traditionally done, and how has this consultation process been different from that. Also, there was advice that Waterfront Toronto give the public a sequence of decision-making and a more concrete timetable, not just of Waterfront Toronto's review, but what this process will look like as a whole if it goes to more levels of government. So really clarity around those in a very digestible way for the public was the advice around that. And then the last comment on the public education was, as Waterfront Toronto moves forward, it's really incumbent on them to be clear about the investments they've already made in the land, and that those investments were made with public funds, and that it has increased the land value. And so not only should that be made available to the public, but Waterfront Toronto should consider that when considering Sidewalk Labs' proposal to get that land at a discounted rate. And one last, very quickly, the role of the public administrator in management entities. This is, it was identified that this is obviously different and novel, so more clarity needs to be given around that, specifically around accountability of these entities, why the public administrator and management entities need to be entirely different, and whether or not the public has a way of accessing them. All right.
So in our group, we started by asking some questions for clarification. And so one of the questions for clarification that was asked was, how does the partnership agreement between Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs, as it currently exists, within the legislation that established Toronto? How does that partnership agreement enable? How does the legislation enable the partnership agreement? Another question for clarification that was asked was, in the future, will Sidewalk Labs be able to respond to future RFPs to be a vertical developer? Another question that was asked is, what's the extension path to make the legislative changes that are being proposed for this project available to other projects throughout the province? Another question that was asked is, what is the backstop mechanism to address cost overruns and delays?
Are you going to walk through all of your questions?
No.
In your report? Okay, good.
Okay.
Because there were plenty, and we'd be here all day.
Yeah. In terms of aspects that people were comfortable and supportive of, there is a general support for a future public bidding process. There is also support for the fact that this is an innovative proposal, and it was appreciated that Sidewalk Labs does engage in advocacy and public engagement around these ideas. In terms of where people were uncomfortable or saw risks, somebody did express that this does seem like a bait and switch, in the sense that it does seem like the proposal that was put forth was an overreach. There was concern about the fact that this does seem to be the privatization of governance. There was concern that there was an agreement that this should not all pass, that future development should not all pass through Sidewalk Labs. And people were uncomfortable with the fact that the capital fund is only $10 million. They thought that that capital fund needs to be bigger. In terms of conditions for moving forward, the implementation of the LRT line, there needs to be a commitment of funding Another condition was that Waterfront Toronto needs to retain control of the land and the implementation agreements going forward. And it was also a condition that it should be a revenue sharing model rather than a profit sharing model. And that's a high level selection of what was discussed at our table.
We had a super rich discussion, and as you're talking, I'm like, oh, I didn't say that. There are a lot of extremely insightful and thoughtful comments that came from this group. We will endeavor to get that out all as clearly as we can and have you have a chance to review it. I just have to pause and say that when people go to a public consultation, often there are many different versions of what unfolded, and our responsibility as the facilitation team is to somehow not only capture the detail of what you said, but also synthesize it to the point where somebody who's only going to read 2 or 3 pages gets a flavor of what's unfolded. It's a decision support tool. So we're going to try and do the both for you, and you will see that in draft, as I said. There is no question that the insight that all of you are providing is going to be of great help to Waterfront Toronto as they continue to figure out their path forward. So we're a little bit behind. I would love it if we can all head straight up to the plenary room upstairs, where we will report with some difficulty on a summary of what happened in this room.